They bulldozed my wife's ashes, and I need you to understand that this is not a metaphor or a dramatic opening designed to shock you into attention. It is simply the most accurate way I know how to describe the moment I stepped out of my truck and realized that the place my heart still considered home no longer existed in any recognizable form. Because what stood in front of me was not a damaged cabin or a condemned structure or even a mistake waiting to be corrected, but a wide, flattened, wound in the earth where love, memory, and grief had all been buried together without permission. For several seconds I stood completely still, not because I was calm, but because my body refused to move until my mind caught up, my boots sinking slightly into disturbed soil, the air thick with the smell of diesel and torn pine, my eyes scanning left and right in disbelief as if the porch, the steps, the windows, the walls might suddenly reassemble themselves if I just looked hard enough. And for one absurd moment, I honestly wondered if grief had finally broken something inside me so badly that I had driven to the wrong place. That illusion shattered the moment I saw the pine tree, the one Emily Carter and I planted with our own hands during our first spring at the cabin beside Silver Pine Lake. Its trunk scarred and leaning under the weight of rubble, yet still alive, still stubbornly rooted in the soil we chose together. And in that instant my chest tightened so sharply I had to grab the door of my truck just to stay upright. Because if the tree was real, then everything else was real too. That cabin was never about escape or rebellion or some romantic fantasy of living off the grid. It was about survival after exhaustion. It was the place we built when we realized we were done proving anything to anyone, done chasing noise and titles and validation, and ready to spend whatever time we had left measuring days by light on the water instead of deadlines on a calendar. Emily used to say the lake breathed slower than the rest of the world, that if you sat quietly long enough your thoughts would eventually fall into step with it. And after she died, that place became the only environment where my grief didn't feel like an ambush waiting every morning. Because there, silence felt intentional rather than empty. Her ashes rested by the east-facing window, not out of superstition or ritual, but because she loved mornings, loved the idea that light always came back even when people didn't, and every day I opened those curtains and said her name softly, not because I believed she could hear me, but because saying it felt like choosing love over erasure. So when I saw the yellow caution tape fluttering where our porch used to be, the tire tracks cut deep and careless into the soil, the complete absence of the window where her urn once stood, shock moved through me first, then pain, and finally something quieter and more dangerous, because when grief has already taken everything once, it leaves behind a kind of clarity that doesn't panic easily. When Sheriff Thomas Hale, an old friend from another lifetime, arrived with his deputies, followed by a hesitant reporter from North Valley News, his voice stayed professional, and even while his eyes apologized, and the explanation came exactly the way all institutional failures do, wrapped in calm language and official phrasing. Cedar Heights Homeowners Association had filed an emergency safety complaint, claiming the structure was hazardous, illegally built, and encroaching on HOA-managed land. The city approved expedited demolition based entirely on documentation that looked legitimate enough to avoid scrutiny. No inspection, no notice, no court order, no one walking the property, no one asking who lived there or what might be inside. Just authority moving faster than conscience. When I asked what happened to my wife's ashes, the silence that followed answered me more honestly than any words could have, because mistakes come with apologies, and no one there seemed to believe an apology was necessary. The headquarters of Cedar Heights HOA looked exactly like the kind of place that never expected to explain itself. All glass and steel and carefully shaped greenery. Fountains designed to sound calming rather than joyful. The entire building projecting the quiet confidence of people who believed they were untouchable. And when I walked inside wearing boots still dusted with the remains of my cabin, the receptionist's expression shifted from boredom to irritation before it ever reached curiosity. That detail mattered, because it told me everything about how often they dealt with people like me, not as humans, but as inconveniences. Margaret Whitlock, the HOA president, greeted me with a polished smile and a posture that suggested she was already winning a conversation we hadn't started yet. Her voice smooth, measured, fluent in the language of policy, she spoke in procedures and regulations instead of sentences that acknowledged consequence. She explained how everything had been done by the book, how the city had cooperated fully, how responsibility ultimately rested with homeowners who failed to keep records current. And when I interrupted her to say Emily's name, to explain what had been destroyed along with the structure, she paused only briefly before saying that human remains were outside HOA jurisdiction, as if grief respected boundaries drawn on a zoning map. Then she slid a document across the desk, $5,000 offered in exchange for my signature waiving all legal claims, calling it a goodwill gesture meant to help everyone move forward. And I wondered how many people before me had taken that money not because it was fair, but because exhaustion is often cheaper than justice. She referred to my cabin as an eyesore, said it dragged down property values, said communities required standards, and then she leaned back, smiled faintly, and made the assumption that would ultimately undo her. She said I was just a man hiding in the woods, off the grid, irrelevant, someone no one would believe over a respected HOA with city connections. I recorded everything, quietly, because arrogance has a habit of speaking freely when it thinks it is safe. She never once asked who I was, never questioned why someone would live simply by choice, never considered that silence might be strategic rather than submissive. That night my phone began to ring. A representative from Summit Financial Group called first, confused and cautious, asking why my name appeared on loan structures tied to Cedar Heights infrastructure. A county clerk followed with an old boundary survey, clearly showing my land well outside HOA control, and with each call the picture became clearer rather than more chaotic. I owned Clearflow Utilities, the water supplier for Cedar Heights. I owned Pine Ridge Access Road, the only legal access point into the development. And I was the quiet creditor behind several loans the HOA depended on to function, leverage built slowly over decades precisely because I never needed attention. Margaret Whitlock had mistaken my quiet for weakness, and systems always punish that kind of arrogance eventually. I didn't threaten, I didn't shout, I didn't demand apologies. I moved the way systems move, deliberately, legally, without emotion, because the law rewards patience far more often than outrage. Daniel Cross, my former student-turned-attorney, stepped in without hesitation. Lena Morales, an investigative journalist with a reputation for thoroughness, began pulling records. And then the most painful ally emerged, Evan Whitlock, Margaret's son, carrying years of guilt and finally willing to speak. What we uncovered was not a single error but a pattern: expedited demolitions, forged notices, intimidation disguised as governance. Families erased quietly because no one believed they could fight back against something that looked official. So I applied pressure where it was allowed. Toll gates were installed on Pine Ridge Access Road. Water rates adjusted according to contracts Cedar Heights had signed and never read. Loans called in exactly as written. Every move documented, transparent, devastating, and suddenly the confidence inside that glass building began to fracture. Residents panicked. Meetings turned hostile. Questions multiplied faster than excuses, and at the county forum, cameras rolling, I laid everything out: documents, recordings, photographs of rubble and missing remains, testimonies from families who had been silenced before, and Evan stood and told the truth about his own mother. Margaret Whitlock didn't argue. She couldn't, because the system she had hidden behind finally recognized her. And when she resigned under pressure, investigations followed naturally and relentlessly. The cabin was rebuilt where it had always stood. Emily's ashes returned to the window she loved, the pine tree taller than before, and with the settlement funds, I founded the Silver Pine Property Rights Foundation, not for revenge, but for prevention. Because justice is not only about punishment, it is about memory, accountability, and refusing to let bureaucracy erase the people it was meant to serve. So I leave you with this question. When the quietest person in the room finally stands up after being dismissed by power, do we call it revenge, or do we finally call it justice?